Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Sara Decoster. I'm the Director of Education at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. And today we are doing a presentation that is part of our weekly series, Understanding Holocaust History. And our topic today is Rescue, Hope, and Action. And today my co-host is going to be our Chief of Education, Dr. Sara A Bosch-Jacobson. And we are going to talk a little bit about rescuers in very different forms during the Holocaust. This series is hosted every week at 1 p.m. on Thursdays. And I just wanted to give you a heads up too that next week will be another great presentation by our museum archivist, Felicia Williamson, who will do an artifact interaction focusing on the Ellen Lubkatz collection. And I just wanted to highlight that before we start, because that is an amazing collection that we have. Several of the parts of the collection are on display in our exhibition, including Ellen's prisoner uniform and some images. And this will be definitely a not missed presentation as well. So thank you for joining us today. And I think that we are ready to get started. So throughout our museum, a big theme and a big importance that we both historical and educationally lay upon our exhibition and everything that we do is our Upstander mission and is our Upstander theme. And as you enter the exhibit, the first thing you see is this bright red Upstander wall that you hopefully see in front of you as well, that has the definition of an Upstander on it. And when we were constructing the museum and designing the museum, that was a big core that we wanted to off the bat want people to know about. And so we had to form a really strict definition of what we as a museum saw was an Upstander, because when our museum first was founded by the survivors, this was already a concept that they toyed with, and it always had been kind of part of it, and especially even at the Dallas Holocaust Museum in the 2000s, this was definitely a theme that was really core of our exhibition too. And while this was always for several decades part of the education that we did at the museum, the concept of Upstander had evolved. I remember walking one day into Starbucks and seeing the word Upstander on a Starbucks coffee cup. And so that word has been used now and has gotten a much broader connotation that we use it for. And so that's why we wanted visitors to introduce of what we consider is an Upstander. So for us, an Upstander is a person that stands up for other people and their rights, combats injustice, inequality, and unfairness, and sees something wrong and works to make it right. And the topic that we are discussing today, rescue, is definitely part of that Upstander behavior that we look at in the exhibit. And we, just as Upstander is a broad term, rescue is in a sense a broad term as well. Rescue during the Holocaust came in so many different forms. And a lot of times we have that very unique idea of one person, usually a non-Jew, helping a Jewish person during the Holocaust. And it is usually by hiding them or smuggling them out or some kind of form. I'm thinking of the case of Miep Hees, who helps hide the Frank family, is probably one of the most famous rescuers during the Holocaust. And so today, part of what we're going to be talking about is the different aspects of a rescue and how they come in so many forms, and it kind of more broadening our horizon on rescue during the Holocaust. And hopefully at the end of this lecture, you'll get a little bit of different perspective on Holocaust rescue. I do want to say, please feel free to ask questions as we go along. As this is a webinar, you are still able to interact with us through our Q&A button, which should be at the bottom of your screen. If you click that button, you can ask us questions as we're going, and Dr. A Bosch-Jacobson and I both have our Q&A open so that we can see your questions coming in, and so we can incorporate them in a lecture and answer them for you. I do ask, just for reference, is to keep your questions as direct as possible. It helps with the reading and processing them as they are going in. I do want to say that this webinar is recorded as well, but that just our images recorded through a webinar function, your camera and your view is actually not recorded in that sense. So, as we introduce the concept of upstanders at the beginning of our exhibit, it remains throughout the exhibit a big narrative line throughout. And we wanted to make sure that visitors didn't miss that. So that big red upstander wall, that color that you see up there, it continues throughout the exhibit. And whenever you see that, and I put some examples up here on my screen of that are just sprinkled throughout the exhibit. Whenever you see that color red, be it on these big panels, which we call our upstander panels that highlight one upstander, or be it on our special topics panels, which you can see are these gray panels right here, which have the red lettering on it. This is where we have on a panel that we're highlighting a unique upstander. You can see this is the same on one of our rail panels right here. So anytime if it's red lettering or a full red panel, that is an indicator that we are talking about that upstander behavior. And many of them are rescuers in many different forms. So I just wanted to share that and show you how ingrained all of this is to our museum and how important it is to share that information with our visitors. Okay, thank you. Becky is letting me know that sometimes the buttons are not always on the bottom. If you are on a tablet, that most likely your button for the Q&A might be on the top of your screen. That is good to know because I'm always on a desktop or a laptop. Thank you, Becky, for sharing that. Okay, so we are going to start with our first rescuer, and Dr. Sarah A Bosch is going to introduce, in this case, him to us.
Okay, so thank you for joining us today. I wanted to reiterate Charlotte's remarks, and I wanted to tell you that this is always one of my favorite presentations and interactive discussions that we get to do, because to highlight some of the upstanders in our show us section is just such a treat. I mean, these are people who were extremely humble, who when asked, you know, why were you, well, they weren't asked why were you an upstander, but why did you do what you do? Why did you put yourself at risk? The response is always, well, what else could I do? There's never a sense of, you know, because I'm a good person or because I needed to be a hero or any of that. Their thought is really that they did what anybody else in the situation would do. And Witold Pilecki is no exception to this rule. So the first thing I would stress is that his name is Witold. The W is a V in Polish, and Pilecki, the C is a T sound, so Witold Pilecki. So Pilecki is a really interesting figure. He is born in 1901, and he is born to Polish parents, but he's born in Russia because Poland, if you think back to your history, doesn't exist. Poland vanishes from the map in 1795 and doesn't reemerge on the map of Europe until 1918. He's born to parents who come from a minor line of nobility, and they are landowners. And he ultimately goes on to be a Polish cavalry officer when Poland reemerges after World War I. He becomes an intelligence agent, and he also serves as a resistance leader. What is spectacular about him for our purposes is that he is the only man that we are aware of who ever volunteered to be arrested to go to Auschwitz. I mean, it's a spectacular act. So how do we get there? Well, Pilecki, between the wars, is a Polish Catholic nationalist and a staunch supporter of the Polish state that reemerges in 1918. In 1939, Poland calls up its army and very, very briefly fights the Nazis when they invade on September 1, 1939. Pretty quickly, the Polish resistance is destroyed and Poland surrenders. At that point, Poland is split between Nazi occupation in the West and Soviet occupation in the East. Pilecki contacts the Polish underground. There's a Polish home army, a Polish underground, which consists of numerous different organizations, and there's also a Polish government in exile that functions in London. And the underground resistance / army group that he belongs to in 39-40 is headed by a man who is a Polish Catholic nationalist, as is he, but his thought about Poland, the head of this underground organization, is that the reason they lost to the Nazis is because they were not right-wing enough in their politics and because they were not pushing for a Catholic country. That if Poland became an all-Catholic country, that would somehow make it more appealing to the Nazis. The Nazis would then treat them less harshly and ultimately potentially give them their liberty. Pilecki doesn't agree with any of this, but Pilecki is first and foremost an army man, loyal to the military. So what he attempts to do is broker a deal between the underground organization to which he belongs and the larger underground organization, which is more neutral in its political views, because the organization to which Pilecki belongs has become increasingly anti-Semitic in the period between 39 and 40, as the head of the organization hopes to kind of make some sort of peace with the Nazi occupiers. Pilecki himself, and I want to be very clear about this, although he's a Polish Catholic nationalist, is not an anti-Semite. He doesn't have an anti-Semitic bone in his body, and we'll come back to very briefly some of the proof as to why I say that is true. The long and the short of this is that the merger that Pilecki brokers between the larger, more neutral Polish underground organization and his rightist Polish underground organization is successful, but as a last thank you to him, and I'm using that sarcastically, the head of the Polish right-wing underground volunteers him, or actually doesn't volunteer, but suggests that he go to this newly formed camp known as Auschwitz to see what's going on there. And Pilecki listens and decides that, yes, he does want to volunteer to do this. And so it is decided in August of 1940 that Pilecki will get himself arrested, and he will get himself sentenced to Auschwitz. I mean, Auschwitz is not a death camp at this point. It's an early concentration camp in Poland. And so his superiors approve the plan, and under the false name of Tomasz Serafiński, he gets himself rounded up in September 19th of 40, along with 2,000 other Polish civilians. He's interrogated, he's tortured, and then he is shipped off to Auschwitz. And he is imprisoned in Auschwitz then from October of 1940 until April of 1943. He spends voluntarily and willingly 2.5 years in Auschwitz. I mean, it's really a remarkable, remarkable story. While he is in Auschwitz, he works with the Polish Home Army, and he sets up a network of Polish resistors who number over 200, all operate with secret names. They are not communist in their orientation. And he gets information out of Auschwitz regularly to the British, to the Polish government in exile, and more generally to the Allies. And he, with the operatives that he has working with him, goes so far as to set up a clandestine radio station in Auschwitz from which they broadcast reports of what's happening. So he is there when they first gas Soviet POWs, when they are attempting to figure out their gassing setup. He is in Auschwitz when the first Jews arrive. He is in Auschwitz when they start to murder Jews in mass numbers. And in fact, after he escapes from Auschwitz, he reports to the West that he thinks that there will be approximately 1.5 million Jews murdered in Auschwitz. He's off by a few. I mean, this is his guesstimate, and we think that it was about 1.1 million murdered. As part of his activities when he gets out of Auschwitz, he ultimately gets to Warsaw, and in Warsaw, he hooks up with the Polish Home Army, and in 44, they fight, they rise up as part of the Warsaw Uprising, not the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. He fights in the Warsaw Uprising. He is captured by the Germans. He is sent to Germany. He spends the rest of the war, so from 44 to 45, as a guest of the Germans in a Stalag camp. After the war, he goes to Italy, where he hooks up again with Polish elements of the Free Polish government and Free Polish military. They send him back to Warsaw to collect information on the communists and the Soviets who have moved into the greater Polish area. Ultimately, in 46, his cover is blown. He is told by his superiors to get out of Poland. He says, no, I'm a Polish patriot. I'm a Polish nationalist. This is my home. I can't do this. He is captured the following year by Polish communists who work with their new Soviet masters. And in 48, after a show trial, he's shot in the back of the head and buried in an unmarked grave. What you see here is a picture of the report that he wrote. He wrote a report first in 43. It was a 100-page report on what he had witnessed in Auschwitz. Subsequently, in 45, when he had a little bit of downtime, he wrote a multi-100-page volume about his experiences, which was only recently published in English. I'm looking for the name of it. I had it down somewhere. Hold on a second. I'll find it. I'll find it later, and I'll put it in the Q&A section for you. Or excuse me, the chat section for you. But his major contribution then is to deliberately get himself arrested as part of resisting the Nazi occupiers, to organize resistance in Auschwitz itself, and to get word out of exactly what was going on in Auschwitz when nobody really knew. And he sent it out through multiple channels. Charlotte?
Okay, well, I actually picked two upstanders together and two rescuers together here. And these are rescuers that helped in a diplomatic way help Jews during the Holocaust, and actually in a unique sense, and both worked in the same country and were actually connected to each other. Most of you might know Juni Sugihara, who was a Japanese diplomat. He was the vice consul for the Japanese Empire in Kaunas, Lithuania. And at the same time, the gentleman, so this is Sugihara here, a Japanese vice consul. And at the same time, there was a gentleman from the Netherlands who was the part-time acting consul for the Dutch government in exile. The reason he was chosen for this is because at this point, it was 1940, and Germany had already occupied the Netherlands, and Zwartendijk right here was working for Philips Industries at that point, which is a Dutch company, was working in Lithuania. And the official consul had basically been removed once the Netherlands got occupied. And with that, Zwartendijk became the part-time acting consul. So these two men were actually in very close proximity. In a sense, the main diplomats representing their countries. One, an ally of Germany with Japan, and the other one is an occupied government with Zwartendijk, the Netherlands. And so these two found ways that they could use their diplomatic power, in a sense, to help Jews. So they actually did it in the same way, and knowing that they connected together, they would actually be able to help more. Sugihara was able to give transit visas that would allow Jews to travel through Japanese territory. This was important because it would allow Jews in Lithuania to exit Lithuania. You actually needed, during this time, visa-wise, not only a visa to go somewhere, but also a visa to exit your country and to travel through other countries if you were traveling by boat or by train or any other way. So the visas that Sugihara delivered were, in a sense, exit and travel visas that allowed Jews to get out and especially travel eastwards through Russia, the Soviet Union at that point, and then southwards into China, or even make it to areas such as Australia and Japan itself. So this was really a way to escape the Nazis and to move eastward. The problem with that is that Sugihara, in a sense, does not deliver an actual entry visa to somewhere else. And this is what Zwartendijk was able to give. As the Dutch government in exile still controlled one of its colonies, the Curaçao, the Dutch government in exile could give entry visas into Curaçao. So if the two worked together, Sugihara could give travel visas, and Zwartendijk could actually give entry visas as well. Although both men knew very well that it wasn't about the actual getting to Curaçao. It was more about exiting and being able to escape out of Lithuania and moving eastwards. So Jews would come, both actually first the Jewish community started approaching Zwartendijk, and then later on Sugihara as well, and then these two men connected to put really this whole instrument together of issuing visas. And once Sugihara realized how he could help Jews this way, he was continuously giving as many of these visas as possible for them to get out. It is estimated that Sugihara saved 6,000 Jews by allowing them to flee Lithuania and to move eastwards. It is also estimated that during his time as an acting consul, that Zwartendijk wrote 2,345 visas for Curaçao. They all started as soon as this plan came together, because before that there were no visas being issued for Curaçao. And so I wanted to actually show here on my slide as well one of these visas that was issued to kind of give you an example. So here on top, in the top corner, you actually see the transit visa here to Suriname and Curaçao that is given, and you can see the travel visa in between is through Japan. So see the transit visa here? So this is the combination of that working together of the entry visa to Suriname and Curaçao that Zwartendijk delivered, and the travel journey allowing through Japan. So the transit visas right here. And so you can see this is then issued by the consul of Japan, and that was Sugihara. So you can see the big consulate stamp on here as well, and that. So this was a very unique partnership of these two diplomats working together to find a way to rescue Jews. Both of them, after the war, went, actually during the war already, went back to their respective countries and lived a very quiet life. Sugihara was kind of lost a little bit in his career position because what he had done was actually against what his government had told him. They had told him he should not be doing that. So not following instructions that were given out and going against instructions did not improve his career. Zwartendijk went back to work for Philips and actually became known as Mr. Philips in the Netherlands, and assisted in some other rescue networks and the resistance in the Netherlands as well. But it took a time after the war for people to come aware. Sugihara was the first one that was recognized, and in 1985 received the Righteous Among the Nations title from Yad Vashem that honors Gentile rescuers of the Holocaust. But it was much later that Zwartendijk was recognized. He was not as well known about his rescue efforts in Lithuania. So it wasn't until 1997 that Zwartendijk for the first time was really truly recognized for its efforts. Just to give you an idea, another little tidbit of information is that this year in Lithuania is the year of Chinu Sugihara. So the whole country of Lithuania is celebrating his rescue efforts. And a research project that has been done is on the descendants of those who received visas from Sugihara, is that there is now 100,000 people alive today that are alive because of the people that Sugihara saved. So that's a pretty impressive number right there. So, so this is, again, a unique way is using diplomacy, using visas for rescue. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. A Bosch, who has very unique ones.
Okay, so when Dr. Decoster introduced all of this, she talked about the fact that we were talking about rescuers today. And we are, but we're also talking about resistors. So we're really doing both of these. And in the case of Hans or H.A. Ray and Margaret Ray, they're both rescuers and resistors. They resist the Nazis ultimately through flight and through culture, and they're involved in rescue, and that rescue in their case would be self-rescue. So if you didn't know, they obviously are the creators of Curious George. They're also German Jews, or they were German Jews. They've both passed away now. So let me give you a little bit about their background. And the reason I love their story so much is that we have a tendency when we talk about World War II to think of people who pick up arms and fight, or people who hide other people. We have a tendency to forget just how incredibly all-encompassing the war was, and that it's not just a physical war, a spiritual war, a military war. It's also a cultural war. And the Rays, had they not survived, would have left our culture, particularly children's literary culture, much, much poorer for their failure to survive. And so it really is a remarkable story. So the two protagonists in this story are Hans Augusto Reyersbach, or H.A. Ray here. I'm pointing at my screen, but you're not going to see it, or H.A. Ray, and Margaret Elizabeth Waldstein, right here. And they were both born in Hamburg, Germany. H.A. Ray was born in Germany in 1898, and he served in World War I. Afterwards, he became a painter of circus posters for a living. He had grown up in a comfortable middle-class Jewish home in Hamburg, and they happened to live near the Hamburg Zoo. And so he had always been interested in animals, and that was his first career. He studied at some German universities after starting his circus poster business, and decided to go to Brazil and to pursue his fortune there. In Brazil, in the mid-1920s, he did a couple of things, one of which is highly significant, the one isn't, but it's amusing. The highly significant thing that he did is he took Brazilian citizenship, which is an extremely important thing because it meant that he had a passport other than a German passport, which in the 20s nobody would have thought anything about, but by the 1930s for a Jew, that's vital. The other thing that he did is he spent his early time in Brazil selling bathtubs in the Amazon. Don't ask. And I can't find anything anywhere about whether he was successful at it or not. It doesn't sound to me like a great idea, but that is what he did. His wife-to-be, Margaret Waldstein, was born in 1906, so she's a few years younger than he. And she left Hamburg to become a photographer in London. So she also had artistic leanings. In 1935, she went to Rio, where H.A. Ray was living. They had, in fact, known each other when they were younger. He, when he was probably a young teen, had seen her. She was a much younger child sliding down the banisters of her parents' home. She was a bit of a firecracker. Anyway, they re-met in Brazil and they got married. They fell in love, they got married, and they founded an advertising agency, and that was the end of the bathtub sales in the Amazon. He, Hans, changed his name from Ryersbach to Ray at that time. His reasoning was that the Brazilians couldn't pronounce Ryersbach and they could say Ray. And so he became no longer Hans Ryersbach, he became H.A. Ray. She also simplified the spelling of her name to Margret from Marguerite, which is what it had been. When they got married, they decided to take a honeymoon in Paris. They left for Paris, but not before Margaret also became a Brazilian citizen. So they both had Brazilian passports. Very, very important. They sailed to Europe on their honeymoon with 2 monkeys. It's very important, 2 marmoset monkeys. And as part of her honeymoon activities, she knit sweaters for these little monkeys. Unfortunately, the monkeys didn't survive the journey. They're not meant for shipboard journeys. They ended up settling in Montmartre in Paris, and they fell in love with it and they decided not to return to Brazil. And they began writing and illustrating children's books. Hans did the illustrations and Margaret did the text for the books. And by 1939, they had received an advance for their first book from a publishing house which had looked at his sketches and her accompanying stories and loved it. The book that they got the advance for was Rafi and the 9 Monkeys. And one of those monkeys, the littlest of those monkeys in this book, Rafi and the 9 Monkeys, was named Fifi. In 39, he began to work on a story specifically about Fifi, but in September of that year, the war broke out. The Rays moved to South France because they thought they would be safer there. And right before the Nazi invasion, they moved back to Paris to grab all of their things because they realized that they were probably going to have to get out of France. It was at that point when refugees came pouring into central and southern France from the north as the Nazis were moving through, that the 2 of them went to a bike shop. The only bike, so the story goes, that was available at the bike shop was a tandem bike. They tried it out and said, this is not going to work. And so what happened was H.A. bought a whole series of bike parts from the store and put together from parts 2 bicycles for them, and they left Paris 1 step ahead of the Nazis on these bikes that they had created. They began biking south. Their journey on their journey, they brought with them the sketches, the illustrations for what in 1941 is going to be published in the United States as the first Curious George book. And it was the story of Fifi. They hadn't renamed him yet. And they brought some food with them in their baskets. They did a combination of bike and train travel. They ultimately made it over the Pyrenees and into Spain. Then they made it through Spain to Portugal. From Portugal, they were able to use their Brazilian passports in 1940-41 to travel across the ocean to Brazil, where they were citizens. They spent very little time in Brazil, and they ultimately left Brazil for New York. And in 1941, they published the Curious George book. So self-rescue, cultural resistance, and one of the things that's really remarkable about the 7 books that they created together, and then Hans dies in the 70s, and Margaret, with another illustrator, continues to make to produce, you know, the narratives that she has an illustrator illustrate. The books, in addition to being beloved by children, I think reflect on some level the experiences that they had come through, where there's this naughty little monkey, but there's this safety valve that this monkey has, which is that no matter what happens to him, there is this protector, this man in a yellow hat who swoops in at the end of the day and helps him. And I think that that probably is an outgrowth of some of the experiences that they had while they were in Europe. But again, we wouldn't have the legacy of Curious George if they hadn't taken steps to escape the Nazis. Charlotte?
I love the story of Curious George as well. We had an exhibit when we were at our previous location about it, and I just loved that exhibit. It was so fun to work on and then to work with. So I'm going to shift to a different type of rescuer. In this case, a rescuer that, in a sense, in the end, does not succeed. Not all rescue succeeds. Sometimes rescuers try their best, and they get nowhere. And so I really wanted to highlight a rescuer that tried everything possible in his power, but faced a lot of obstacles and had to find different ways. And I want to start this by reading a telegram that came out that was sent to the Nazi government in the Netherlands on July 11th, 1942. And that was just a few weeks after the deportations of Jews from the Netherlands to Poland, to the death camps in Poland, had started. And this telegram goes: the undersigned Dutch churches, already deeply shocked by the actions taken against the Jews in the Netherlands that have excluded them from participating in normal life of society, have learned with horror of the new measures by which men, women, children, and whole families will be deported to the German territory and its dependencies. The suffering that this measure will bring upon tens of thousands of people, the knowledge that these measures are contrary to the deepest moral sense of the Dutch people, and above all, the hostilities of these measures against the divine norms of justice and mercy, urge the churches to direct to you the urgent petition not to execute these measures. And what I just read to you was, as I said, this telegram that was sent on July 11th by a consortium of Catholic churches and other religious institutions in the Netherlands. And this consortium was led by the Archbishop of the Netherlands, Archbishop Johannes de Jong. And de Jong had considerable power, not just within the Netherlands, but he was recognized as a young and very inspiring archbishop within the Catholic Church. And this inspiration really led him to bring that consortium of religious institutions together and make that very, as you just heard, very strong condemnation of the deportations and a call to end them. By the way, this call is extremely rare. There's very few instances of public figures calling against, so publicly calling against the deportation of the Jews. And just to kind of give you an idea how public this was, is that first it is sent in a telegram, and the Nazis respond to it pretty immediately the Nazi government in the Netherlands by saying, okay, fine, we will not deport Christian Jews, Jews who have converted to just Christianity, which, by the way, was just a way of appeasing them. And that does not stop, because on July 20th, Johannes de Jong decides to take this telegram and insert it into a pastoral letter. And a pastoral letter is basically that goes from the bishops of the Netherlands to all the priests in the local villages and is then read out during Sunday Mass. And so on July 26, 1942, in every single Mass at a Catholic church in the Netherlands, this pastoral letter from de Jong was read out from the pulpit and given to all Catholics in the Netherlands. Just to see how internationally that created some kind of reaction is that this news went out, and I'm going to try and zoom in a little bit, all the way to in the New York Times. There was a whole article talking about how the churches in the Netherlands defied Hitler and stood against him. So this was a big action, and in a sense, de Jong was very unique as an archbishop to take this stance, especially since the Vatican at this point has remained silent and will remain silent from them. And actually, de Jong has quite a big role to play in that, because once the pastoral letter goes out and is read out on July 26th, the next day, the Nazi government in the Netherlands goes out and does an arrest, and they arrest over 400 Jews that have converted to Christianity, mainly Catholic Jews, and deport them within the next few days to camps in Germany and the death camps, most of which will be murdered at Auschwitz-Birkenau. And this is a shock because this attempt at rescuing, at stopping these deportations has not worked. The deportations continue, and the Netherlands will have one of the highest death tolls of any country during the Holocaust, and especially much, much higher than its neighboring countries of Belgium and France and Western Europe. And so in the end, the letter does not do anything. And it also makes the Vatican realize the risk of speaking out. There is documentation that the Pope, when he receives news of what has happened and the actions of de Jong, that influences him to not speak out and not do anything, and that there needs to be other ways to act. And de Jong realizes this too, that this letter will, openly speaking out won't do anything. And so de Jong retreats back and will not speak out again to the Nazi government. But he does realize that there's other avenues besides speaking out, and he knows he's being watched. So instead, he uses people under him, secretaries and other folks, to funnel money from the church to rescue organizations. One of them is the Utrecht University Network, which is a child rescue network led by university students from the University of Amsterdam and Utrecht, that basically place children in hiding. And de Jong will help financially support that network. So while his main rescue effort does not pan out, he does find other ways to help a little bit. And so I did want to give an example of somebody who tries really hard, tries his darnest to do something, but that it doesn't pan out anywhere. And sometimes rescue totally fails. And in this case, it does, and it has immense complications with that. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. A. Bosch for our next group.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte. So this next group is a group that's pretty exciting. These are the Belski partisans, or the Belski Brigade, or the Belski Triad. You see a posed picture of some of the group's fighters on the left of the screen, and on the right of the screen you see a picture of Zush, Tuvia, and Asail Belski. These were three of the Belski brothers. So what can I tell you about the Belskis? They're a very, very interesting group. They're a group of Jewish brothers. The Belski family is a family that lived in what was Lithuania, Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth until 1795. Then the area that they lived in was taken in the Polish partition by the Russian Empire. After World War I, the area in which they lived became Poland. With the outbreak of World War II, the area in which they lived first was occupied by the Soviets, then it was occupied by the Nazis, then it was occupied by the Soviets, and it became Soviet territory until 1990, 91 or so, when it became Belarusia. So it's, and the area didn't move, just so we're clear, because my students used to say, the area moved around? No, empires moved around across it. They are an interesting group of brothers. So they came from a small village in Belarus, or Belarusia at the time, called Stankiewicz. Stankiewicz only had about 6 families in it where they lived. They were the only Jewish family, so they grew up as small farmers, but comfortably well-off farmers. They grew up in the wooded area of Poland, Belarusia. There were 12 children in their family, 2 girls, 10 boys, 2 parents, and in the next larger town over, Novogrodok, they had many other family members, and Novogrodok actually had a sizable Jewish population. The brothers grew up speaking Yiddish at home and speaking Polish or Russian for the most part outside of the home. What we know about Tuvia Bielski, who is going to go on to become the head of the Bielski Brigade, this partisan group, is that while he was born in 1906, by 1917, 1918, so as an 11 or 12-year-old boy, he has been requisitioned by the Imperial German Army as part of the fight against the Empire of Russia during World War I. And because of his Yiddish, they have this young boy serve as an interpreter for them in the area, because his Yiddish is fairly close to German, and so he masters German, which is going to serve him well in his later years as a partisan. He and the 3 brothers here all work as small farmers themselves and occasional businessmen in the area. Each of them is married. And in 1939, with the outbreak of war, the Soviets basically capture their area. We know that Tuvia is unhappy about this because he is considered a bourgeois, because he's a fairly successful farmer. He leaves the town in which he's living with his wife, moves to another town in the region to kind of hide himself and start up a new career. In that new town, strikes up a romance with somebody. One thing leads to another. He divorces his wife, marries this new woman. They have returned with the Nazi invasion of 1941, along with the rest of their brothers, to the family farm in Stankiewicz. And it's there in December of 1941 that the Jews of Stankiewicz, of Novogorod, Novogrodok, and that section of Belarusia are rounded up by the local Einsatzgruppen that have come through, the Nazi killing squads that have come through. And in December of 1941, more than 5,000 of these Jews are shot into pre-dug pits in the forests outside their villages. The brothers, these 3, and Aaron, who's their youngest brother, managed to escape the roundup. And they head for the woods after their parents are shot. They are able to head for the woods because this area of Poland / Belarusia, depending on who controls it at the time, is extremely wooded. And they have a few things going for them. They're multilingual. They speak Polish, they speak Russian, they speak Yiddish, they speak German. They also have, because they grew up in Stankiewicz, surrounded by non-Jews, they have a good working familiarity with the local farmers, the local peasants, and they had good relations with them. They head into the woods in December, January, so December 41 heading into January of 42. And by the spring of 42, they have begun to form a partisan band in the local forests. What makes their partisan band unusual is that they do not require you to be a fighter. All they require is that you make your way to them and you be Jewish. So Tuvia Bielski, who is appointed as the head of this band that begins to emerge around the brothers, is very, very committed to the fact that the Nazis are killing Jews. We can't allow this to happen. We can't turn Jews away. And so what begins to develop around him and his brothers is a really remarkable partisan band. It's not simply a fighting band. In fact, fighting is almost an afterthought for them. What they are is a group that raids many of the local ghettos to help Jews get out, that sends out scouts into the local forests looking for Jews who have made it out of the local ghettos to bring them into the family camp. By late in 1942, there are more than 750 Jews who belong to the Belski Brigade. It's not the romantic picture of the brigade that you would see in the movie Defiance with Daniel Craig. And Tuvia Bielski, as you see here, does not look anything like Daniel Craig, although Daniel Craig makes one good-looking Jew, I always say. I love seeing him in this role, and I'm amused. What can I tell you? But what this group does do is it learns to fight, to run, to live off the land, and ultimately to live off its own resources. It's a very, very involved story, but what I will tell you about is that the Belski brothers managed to survive for 2 full years in the woods of their region. You've seen some of the story if you've seen the movie Defiance. It's very, very interesting because at one point they go deep into the Naliboki forest, which is a forest that's further to the east of where they were because they're being chased by the Nazis in 43. They lead 800 men, women, and children through nasty, muddy swamps onto an island in the center of this forest. And there they rebuild their family camp. The Nazis can't get to them there, and then ultimately the Nazis within a few months pull out of that area. Their family camp manages to survive the way it does because what they do, the Belski brothers do, is they make themselves extremely valuable to the surrounding Soviet partisan population. And the way in which they do this is they set up leather tanneries, they set up granaries, they set up a bakery, they set up a weapons repair factory, all of this underground in pits that they dig in various sections of the forest. It's not an easy life. It's not a nice life. It's a picturesque life. If you're interested in more, there is a very good book written by a woman named Nechama Tech, T-E-C, called Defiance, I think is the name of it. She's an academic, and she wrote the definitive book on them. Suffice it to say that by the time the war is over in Belarusia, as the Soviets push back through, which is June, July of 44, not only have the Belski brothers survived, but they have 1,200 members plus, like 1,263, I think, members of their family camp who have survived with them. So what the Belski Brigade does, being a Jewish brigade, being openly Jewish, being a family brigade, managing to work with the Soviets, managing to feed the people, clothe the people, house the people who are with them, is guarantee the lives of these 1,200 people, some odd. As of 2000, when there was a reunion, we know that those 1,200 people who survived under the Belski's leadership had 25,000 descendants. So it's really a remarkable story. Just to end it for you, Sara Belski, who's the one on the far right here, is picked up and drafted by the Soviets in 45 and dies fighting the Germans. Tuvia and Zush Belski, who are here, along with Aaron Belski, who was their youngest brother, who served as a scout in the brigade, all make it to Israel, all serve in the Israeli War for Independence. Tuvia goes from being incredibly heroic in running this brigade to driving a taxi in modern Israel. They leave Israel in the 50s, and the families together settle in New York because they have an older brother, Walter, who had already been in the US before the war. So he sponsors them to come over, and they live out their lives as a small trucking company, like a trucking company where they own a few trucks, that's it, in the United States. So they go from being, incredibly heroic to basically just living these average lives. But the resistance that they were involved in is like no other form of resistance that we know at that time in that region. And it's Jews helping Jews. It's Jews helping their own. So it's pretty spectacular.
Okay, thank you for joining us. We have 2 more minutes to take a few questions. If anybody has any questions, again, you can put them in the, you can put your questions in the Q&A. I also wanted to remind everybody that next week in our Understanding Holocaust History session, our archivist will be leading us on an artifact interaction on the Alan Lopkot's collection. Again, an amazing collection, and if you're anything interested in Anne Frank, she is a very unique. There's a strong connection there as well. So I hope you'll come participate in that. So thank you for joining us today. I wish you a well and safe afternoon, and hopefully see y'all next week.
Bye-bye.